Hello YouTube and YouTubettes. In this video is about the Table of Nations following the flood of Noah, and I posted I guess you could say edits from Chuck Missler doing a seminar on the Table of Nations. Very interesting stuff, and how it lines up to secular sources of ancient chronologies. I also want to take this minute to recommend a book called After the Flood by William Cooper, or is it Bill Cooper? Not the same as the one that does the conspiracy theory stuff, which I also like, but this is by a creation ministry. And you can actually listen to that book in audio on YouTube. Just type in After the Flood, Bill Cooper. But I didn't have it on this video, but it's the same idea. So, very interesting topic. A fascinating period for me is how the nations were spread through 3 sons, and how you can find evidence of this similarly in ancient chronologies from around the world. So without further ado, here is Chuck Missler, The Table of Nations.
Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, we're going to take them in inverse order. Shem's the most important. We'll take him last. The one that comes first is Japheth. And unto them were sons born after the flood. And what we're going to find out is we're going to go through 70 names. A few of them we'll highlight because they're important to you. But it's interesting. I'll show you when we get to the end why 70 turns out to be an interesting number. But we'll take the sons of Japheth first: Gomer and Magog and Madai and Javan and Tubal and Meshech and Tiras. And then from those 7 you get a few more. You get the sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah. And then the sons of Yavan, Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Dananim. By these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, every one after his tongue, after their families, and in their nations. I want you to notice something. It's going to be important next chapter. These isles or areas or regions of Gentiles divided in their lands, every one after his tongue. The division that's in view here is not continental drift. When we're going to get to a place where it talks about in the days of Peleg, the earth was divided. And many people assume that somehow has to do with continental drift. I think if that happened during the flood. What it's talking about is the division of the languages, which occur in the main event in chapter 11. And this is one of the hints right here to help you get that in perspective. But let's try to lay this out. Japheth had Gomer and Herodotus, who is considered the father of all history, and Plutarch and so forth talk a lot about the Sumerians, which settled along the Danube and the Rhine. So there, Ashkenaz is a son of his that speaks really much of Germany. Riphath, Josephus links that to the Paphlagonians. The word Europe actually derives from the Riphath language, but Togarmah, of course, refers to the Armenians and as well as Turkey and Turkestan. So these are Japheth, Gomer, and then his sons, and then Magog. Now, let me stop here for a minute. Have you ever wondered why, all through the Bible, it uses these weird names? Do you know why it does that? We make it do that. It's our fault. You see, you and I, we keep changing the names of things. There was a city called Petrograd. And then it became St. Petersburg. Then for quite a few years it was Leningrad. Now today it's St. Petersburg again. What will it be next year? Who knows? You know, there was a town called Byzantium that became the capital of the whole world when the capital moved from Rome to there and renamed it Constantinople. When the Muslims overran it, they changed it to Istanbul. There's a place in the United States called Cape Canaveral. How many remember Canaveral? Now it's called Cape Kennedy, and it came that close to being called Cape Hillary. And let's see, we keep changing the names of things, and so if you're Isaiah, and God calls upon you, you know, Isaiah talked a lot about the fall of Babylon, which is really weird if you realize that in Isaiah's day it hadn't even risen to an empire yet. You see, but even more interestingly, Isaiah talks about the Persian Empire coming. Now, how does Isaiah talk about the Persians over 100 years before it shows up in history? He talks about it as Elam, who's the forebear of the Persians. You see, we don't change the name of our ancestors. So if you're trying to talk about the descendants of Abraham, you can do that, because they don't change the name after he's dead. You with me? They may change the name while he's alive, but in other words, your ancestors are those labels. So we get to this Magog label, which is very important when you get to Ezekiel, to figure out who are Magog. And fortunately, there are a couple of writers. Hesiod, who was a Greek didactic poet in the 8th century, wrote a great deal about the descendants of Magog. He called them by their Greek name, the Scythians. Herodotus, who is called by scholars as the father of all history, he wrote in the 5th century BC. These guys are prior to and roughly contemporaries with Ezekiel in the first place. And so their writings are very valuable to us for vocabulary, if nothing else. So the Scythians are the descendants of Magog, and the Scythians in turn are the descendants of a number of tribes, not the least of which are the true Russians. The Scythian Empire, or I shouldn't say empire, the Scythian dominance was on the southern steppes of Russia from the Ukraine all the way to China, from the 10th century BC through the 3rd century BC. They were a nomadic group on horseback, so you couldn't conquer them. They just retreat. And they developed a thing called defense in depth. And that tradition saved Russia against Napoleon, and that tradition saved Russia against Hitler. The whole idea of just retreating and letting the overextended logistics kill off your enemies. And that's what they developed that to a fine art. And that's why Herodotus' writings are so important to the Greeks, because they tried to master all that. Interesting people. But also, under Japheth, we have Medai, who is the father of the Medes, and you and I know them as the Kurds. It's interesting how this ancient group of people who have no country, there's about 25%, give or take, in several different countries. Some part of Turkey, northern part of Iraq, some of Iran, and they're considered a thorn in the flesh by all the countries they reside in, and yet they're people without a country, the Kurds. They emerged about the 10th century BC. They made a coalition with Persia to make the Persian Empire in the 7th century BC. The Medes and the Elamites, the Persians, formed what Cyrus. His mother was a Mede, his father was a Persian, and so he was half of both. And he brought them together to create the incredible Persian Empire that dominated the world for 200 years. Then there's a couple called Tubal and Meshech. They're both identified with major cities in eastern Anatolia, which we know today as Turkey. The eastern 2/3 of Turkey was Anatolia. And by the way, Magog, Tubal, and Meshech are the prominent ones in this invasion of Israel that's yet to take place that may be on the horizon. Yavan, or Ionia, of course, is Greece and a number of other groups. And Tiraz are the Pelasgians of the Aegean, the Etruscans of Italy, and others. So Gomer, as I said, had 3 sons, Ashkenaz, Rephath, and Togarmah. The Armenians today call themselves the House of Togarmah. But that can be misleading because there's a couple other tribes that also regard themselves as descendants of Togarmah. And that also comes up in prophecy a lot. That's why these identities are kind of important to us. And Yavan has a number of these that I won't try to get into all of them, but Tarshish is worth mentioning because there's not conclusive evidence, but there's some suggestive evidence that Tarshish was probably in the British Isles. Most Bible handbook stuff figure it was Cyprus or maybe Spain. They don't have the imagination. They know it is a very distant island that's a source of tin. That's what we know from the scripture. Well, Britain is the source of tin. And also we know from excavations at Stonehenge that they carried on worldwide trade in the Bronze Age period. So it's very possible that Jonah, when he was trying to get as far away from Nineveh as he could think of, took a ship to Tarshish because that was considered as far away as he could think of. Analogous to our figure of speech taking a slow boat to China. See, he took a slow boat to Tarshish was the concept. So Tarshish may be the British Isles, and that has implications. Anyway, so with Japheth we've looked at Gomer, Magog, Madai, Yavan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiraz. Those are 7, but there were 7 sons under those for a total of 14. We'll come back to that later. Then we get to Ham. Now, the Hamites went south, and sons of Ham, Cush, Mitzrayim, Put, and Canaan. And the sons of Cush were Sheba, Havilah, Sabta, Ramah, and Sabteka. And the sons of Ramah were Sheba and Dedan. And Cush begot Nimrod, and he began to be a mighty one in the earth. Many people portray him as a hunter. His symbol also, by the way, was a bow, because he was a hunter, presumably. Except most scholars recognize that what it really means here, he was a mighty one, not as just a mighty hunter. He hunted men. He was the first world dictator. We'll talk more about him. In fact, right here in the middle of this genealogy, we have a little insert. So we have Cush, Mitzrayim, Put, and Canaan. Now, Cush settled east of, Cush settled south of the second cataract of the Nile. Mitzrayim is a dual. We have singles and pairs. It's a dual for Upper and Lower Egypt. And so Mitzrayim is the biblical term for Egypt. Put settled west of Libya. Think of Put as the North Africans, the Berbers, and so forth. They're different genealogically than ones south of. So think of Cush as south and Put to the west in Africa. And Canaan, of course, the Canaanites. That's pretty straightforward. We could talk more about that, but that's pretty. Let's keep going here. Speaking of Nimrod, he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. So he earned a title. He was feared. And at the beginning of his kingdom, he's a kingdom, was Babel, Erech, Akkad, Calneh, and the land of Shinar, or Shinar. Shinar is probably more correct. And so he is the founder of these cities. And Babel, of course, becomes ultimately Babylon. And it's good. We're going to talk a little bit about that in the next session, because Babylon, you can look at the Bible as a tale of two cities. Jerusalem as God's city, and Babylon as man's city or Satan's city. And they're going to be in juxtaposition throughout the Bible. They're going to be in juxtaposition introduced here, and they will be in juxtaposition in the book of Revelation. And we'll talk about that next time, in the next session. So the word Nimrod means rebel, rebelling against God. He is the first world dictator. I like to call the coming world leader, that typically is called the Antichrist, I like to call him as Nimrod II. Not reincarnated, not necessarily genetically related, but in terms of the role that he's going to play. The first world dictator was a Nimrod. The last world dictator will turn out to be a Nimrod. He was the founder of these cities, including Babylon and Nineveh, which of course are prominent cities in ancient history. And we'll detail some of this in the next session. Out of that land went forth Asshur, and builded Nineveh, and the city of Rehoboth, and Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah. The same is a great city. So we see the rise then of these cities, and that's going to give rise to the events of chapter 11. And Mitzrayim began Ludim, and Ananim, and Lahab, and these are all plurals, by the way, Nephtubim. Mitzrayim is, as I say, is basically the term for Egypt, and Babrusim, and Kazluhim, and there's some others I can't pronounce properly, out of whom Philistine. Now, by the way, the Philistines came originally from Egypt. They went from there to Cyprus, and then from Cyprus to the land that we think of, the land of the Philistines. Many Bible handbooks point out that the Philistines came from Cyprus, but they don't reach back far enough because they got to Cyprus from Egypt. That's important to understand. And I often point out that Yasser Arafat is not a Palestinian, he's an Egyptian. But he could technically lay claim, because if he's Egyptian, he could be a Philistine and trace his line back, if you will. The word Philistine, when the Romans got fed up trying to administer Judea in roughly 140 A.D., the Romans were frustrated by Bar Kokhba, who led a revolt. And Bar Kokhba's gang slaughtered the Roman 12th Legion, among other things. Something they never recovered from. It took them 3 years to get their act together before they crushed the Bar Kokhba revolt. But by then, Emperor Hadrian had a bellyful of trying to run this region because of all the tensions. So they came to the conclusion they could never rule Jerusalem as long as there was any Jewish presence in Jerusalem. So they leveled the city, not just the temple, that happened earlier. They leveled the city, they plowed it under, and built a Roman city on top of it called Aelia Capitolina. And they made it a death penalty of any Jew caught in Jerusalem. And they named the whole region after the Philistines, Israel's enemies, as an attempt deny any Jewish presence there. The word Philistine in Latin was Palestina. And the word Palestine is a corruption of the Latin for Philistine. It's a name that's designed to deny Israel's place in the land. So whenever you use the term Palestine, you're using the label of Israel's enemies. You need to understand that. And it all has its roots here in Genesis 10. And Canaan begot Sidon, his firstborn. That leads to all the Phoenicians and so forth, seagoing, the legendary people in seagoing exploits. Canaan begot Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth, and the Jebusite, and the Amorite, and the Girgasite, and the Hivite, and the Archite, and the Sinite, and the Aravadite, and the Zemarite, and the Hamathite, and afterward there were families of the Canaanites spread abroad. Boy, were they spread abroad. Do you know where the Sinites went? Make a guess. S-I-N-O, what does that prefix imply? China, you betcha. The Chinese are a derivative of Canaan, interestingly enough. And many of these tribal names will sound familiar to you because they emerge in the land of Canaan as the adversaries of Israel and Joshua and all of that in the book of Joshua and the book of Judges that follows. And Sidon, of course, is to the north on the coast, becomes the Phoenicians and what have you, and so you can go through these. The capital of the Amorites, of course, was Jericho and so on. And those are very important. And the border of the Canaanites was from Sidon, as thou comest to Gerar, unto Gaza. See the whole coast, from Sidon down to Gaza, as thou goest, unto Sodom and Gomorrah, and to Admah and Zeboim, even to Lasha. These are the sons of Ham, after their families, after their tongues, in their countries, and in their nations. So if you take the Phoenicians and south, include Africa, you've included the Hamites, pretty much. Don't confuse them with Shem, because we're going to get to him next. Ham, Mizraim, Upper and Lower Egypt. It's a dual, by the way. And Memphis and Thebes were the two capitals of the two parts. And, you know, it's interesting. You've probably seen movies and things where the Egyptians are wearing a headdress that has sort of a white cone thing and then a red crown sort of with it. The red crown was, I forget which one's which, I think it was Lower Egypt, and the white was Upper Egypt, and they put them together when they merged. See, when you see that crown, that implies Upper and Lower Egypt, the United Egypt. Each crown was strangely was identities of the two until they got together. And and by the way, if the Philistines are Palestinians, then they're not the sons of Ishmael. Now, one of the things I haven't bored you with through this discussion here is what is an Arab? Because you'll discover if you try to attack that problem, no matter what premise you use, you'll end up in confusion. If you mean geography, you mean those that reside in Arabia, then obviously you exclude Syria, Iraq, Iran, and lots of other places. If you say, no, I mean ethnologically, a descendant of Ishmael, you got a real big problem. Because none of the Palestinians are provably, in fact, nobody can trace their lineage back to Ishmael because they didn't keep distinct records. They intermarried the tribes. And so, and furthermore, they're not descendants of Ishmael in the first place because if you look at the 12 sons, well, let's back up. They were sons, the Bedouins are sons of Keturah. And in other studies, we'll get into some of this and we'll do a chart. When you see the family trees, you realize that much of the myths about the Arabs leads to confusion. What adds to the confusion for all of these, I should mention this right now, is that the ethnic links get muddied up with the geography. For an example, if I say to you I'm a Californian, that implies I lived in California. It doesn't necessarily mean I descended from Californian stock. You with me? And when we talk about tribal areas, a tribe that lives in a certain area gives their name to that region. Other people who in that region then get called by that regional name. Ephraim was a region for the tribe of Ephraim. But many people that came from that region were not necessarily Ephraimites in the sense of being descendants of that tribe. They happened to live in that geography. And that's where a lot of people get confused, especially when you start getting into the 10 lost tribes and all that business. So understand, there's a lot of confusion between the geography and the ethnic links. So let's move on. Cush, of course, is Ethiopia, the Kassites, and some even east of Syria. Most of them settled south of the second cataract of the Nile. They thus become idiomatic, if you will, of black Africa. Nimrod, of course, was of Cush, and he did Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh. Put settled west of Egypt, and Libya, parts of Ethiopia, and North Africa. Canaan, Sidon to Gaza, and Sodom and Gomorrah, and so forth. And Kittag links to Cathay, the Sinites, of course, to China, and so on. So that's Cush with his 4 key people. Let's go to Shem. We're building up to Shem is leaving the best to last in a sense, because Shem is the one we're most concerned with from a biblical perspective. Shem, also the father of all the children of Eber, the father of Japheth the elder, the brother of Japheth the elder, even to him were children born. The children of Shem, Elam, Asher, and Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. And then he goes to then starts breaking them down. The children of Aram was Uz, Hul, and Gether, and Mash. And Arphaxad begat Salah, and Salah begot Eber. We'll come back to him in a minute. And unto Eber were born 2 sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his, that means division, the word means division, by the way. And for in his days was the earth divided. And some people think that means continental drift. I don't think so. I think it's an anticipatory remark that will be amplified in chapter 11. And his brother's name was Yoktan. And Yoktan begot Almadad, and Skeleph, and Hazar Maraveth, and Yarah, and Hadaram, and Uzal, and Diklah, and Obal, and Abimal, and Sheba, and Ophir, and Havilah, and Jobab. All these were the sons of Yoktan. Now, the main use of some of these is if you're playing Bible trivia, but other than that, I'm not sure how useful some of those are. We'll move on. Shem, Elam, we've talked. That represents Persia or Elam, if you will, or Iran, if you will. Asher, Arphaxad. That's the important one for you and I for reasons you'll see shortly. He had Salah. Salah had Eber. And under Eber had a guy by the name of Peleg, in which the earth was divided, but I believe that means the language is the issue in chapter 11. And he had a brother by the name of Yoktan. And then Lud and Aram are mentioned, Aram being the father of the Aramaics and so forth. But in Genesis 11, we're going to pick up on this and add children of Peleg, which will include Ru, Serug, Nahor, Terah, and Abraham. And that's the thing we're leading up to. All this is background for the rest of Genesis. From chapter 12 through 50 is a rundown of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And so this is all a preamble, if you will. So that's why this particular chain is the critical one. And their dwelling was from Mesha, as thou goest from Sephar to the mount of the east. And these are the sons of Shem, after their families, after their tongues, in their lands, after their nations. These are the families of the sons of Noah, after the generations, in their nations. And by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. Now notice here again, we're talking divisions, but by language and by genealogy. That will blur, of course, as life goes on. But there they are. That's the bunch. And what's interesting about these is that, oh, by the way, if you really want to study this, there's some strange divisions among these where the word bene, meaning the sons of, is used 12 times in certain verses. Yalad, meaning he begot. And some people say this is rhetorical style. Others try to make a case here, indicating that perhaps there are some missing links and so forth, not material to us. Canaan's descendants are emphasized because they are the traditional adversaries of Israel. So let's understand why those particular ones are underscored, if you will. Interesting, the boundaries of the promised land, if you didn't notice, we're in verse 19. So you can study that, if you will. And something else, it's interesting that Shem, if you look at the ones that are listed there, there are 26 under Shem, there's 30 under Ham. There's 14 under Japheth, the original 7 plus another 7 descendants of those. The total that's listed here in the so-called Table of Nations of Genesis 10 are 70. And I think that's not accidental. There were 70 nations descended from Noah under Ham, Shem, and Japheth. There were 70 families that went under Jacob and Joseph into Egypt. They entered Egypt in Genesis 46:10. Their boundaries are established according to Deuteronomy 32, verse 7 and 8. The boundaries not just of the families, but of the nations of the world. It's very interesting from the scripture, you can make a case that there are 70 Gentile nations and there are 70 members of the family of Israel, made up Israel. They're both in 70 elements, and both of them, their boundaries are determined not by their foreign policies, not by their weapons technologies, not by their financial acumen, by the ruler of the universe. God sets those. That's interesting. That's interesting. Now, in Genesis 26, they speak of 66 of these. In Genesis 46, they speak of 70. In Acts, you'll hear Stephen speak of 75. Some people get all hung up, gee, the Bible contradicts itself. No, because there are Jacob, Joseph, and Joseph's two sons that Jacob adopts are not included in the 66. That gives you the 70. And, of course, Joseph's grandsons in the Septuagint are listed, the 5 of those, that straighten that mess out. So you've got the 70 that make up the nation Israel. You've got 70 that make up the table of nations. And both of these have their bounds set by God in Deuteronomy 32, verse 8. A little review from Deuteronomy. Thought you'd be interested. Thought we'd just keep moving here. The tower. Next session will be about the Tower of Babel. Very, very important session. We'll discover that all the earth had one language at that time. Most scholars presume that it was Hebrew, or maybe it was a forebear of Hebrew. There was a godless confederacy organized by the first world dictator, Nimrod, which means we will rebel. He organizes capital on the plain of Shinar, creates a tower to heaven, Bab being tower, El being God, a tower to God. It wasn't as naive they're going to climb a ladder and get to heaven. That's not the point. Some people figure, well, it's also high, so in case there's a flood, they'd be able to survive. No, that's all naive. It's a religious thing. It's an astrological temple, and it's there that the zodiac gets corrupted. We'll talk briefly about that. You can look at the entire Bible as a struggle between two cities, at least idiomatically. Babylon, the city of man, or the city of Satan, and Jerusalem, the city of God. So you really want to pay attention to the origin of Babylon, what it signifies, and how it's used throughout the Scripture, and we'll have some huge surprises for you in the next session.